Hello there, I am here to read another few pages from the Hope Chest. Today we're reading pages 113 through 120. And so in the background for me today, this is a trench with soldiers that fought in World War I. 1920 is, I think, 2 years. World War I ended either 1918 or 1919. I think the final treaty was signed in 1919. So this isn't very long after World War I. World War I, I could talk a lot about it. It's super, super interesting, but people thought after World War I that we just had this, the world thought we just had this, terrible tragedy where, millions of men died, entire countries and cities and towns were just destroyed. And so one of the thinking that came out of World War I was, let's not ever have another great war like this again. And so they set up what was called the League of Nations. And then there were a lot of people that thought in 1920 during Violet's time that there would never be a war ever again, because the League of Nations would help prevent the war from ever happening. And of course, we know that didn't happen. There's been lots of wars since the Great War, since World War I, and especially World War II. But that was one sort of thinking that came out of World War I. Another type of thinking that came out of World War I, and we talked a little bit, the text mentioned this a little bit yesterday, was that idea of someone who is a Bolshevist. In Russia, Russia before 1917 was ruled by what was called a czar, and a czar was basically like an emperor or a king over all of Russia. And then in 1917, there was a group of people. They were called radicals, that they believed in a different way of doing things, and they overthrew the government, and they sort of instituted their own socialist government, and that was Lenin and his associates. And so that caused there were ripples around the world with that, because there were a lot of people in the United States that saw these Bolshevists, which is what they called themselves, that overthrew the Tsar. They saw the Bolshevists as being very, very dangerous and have very, very dangerous types of thinking. And so the United States was worried about having Bolshevists in the United States, or people who believed in sort of the same style of government as the Bolshevik rulers in Russia, they'd overthrown the Tsar, one of the most powerful people in the world. So, that's sort of why the Palmer agents were doing what they were doing, is they were trying to find people who were Bolshevists and that believed in sort of radical ideas. And that happened as during World War I is when the Bolshevists overthrew the Tsar and took control of the Russian government. I'm listening to a podcast right now that's super interesting, talking about it. Not right now, because I'm talking to you right now, but, in my leisure time, I'm listening to the Russian Revolution podcast. All right, Chapter 10, Red and Yellow Roses. Thanks for listening to that little introduction by me. It's going to help with understanding some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next few pages. Chapter 10, Red and Yellow Roses. Do you realize that the child born in 1920 will never know war? Miss Dexter asked. It was morning, and the Suffs were cooking oatmeal over the tiny cook stoves at the end of the tourist car, while the car changed trains in Chattanooga. Since the Suffs had rented the whole car to go to Nashville, and they didn't have to get off and change trains at the junction points. Instead, the car itself was unhitched from one train, rolled into a siding, and hitched up to another train. The Great War that ended in 1918 was mankind's last war, Miss Dexter went on. We have a League of Nations now. More than 20 countries have joined it already. In the future, all difficulties between countries will be arbitrated by an international court of justice. Outside the platform, a newsboy called, "Extra! Russians surround Warsaw. Riots in Ireland. English impose martial law." Violet wondered why Miss Dexter was able to imagine such a perfect world and not imagine a place for Myrtle in it. She got up and went over to the stove. Miss Kelly was glopping oatmeal into tin bowls. "Can I have some to take to Myrtle, please?" Violet asked. "Here you go." Miss Kelly handed her a bowl of thick gray oatmeal. Then she reached into a box and handed a liberal handful of raisins on top. "Better give her some extra. Injustice makes a girl hungry." Violet had to get off the train in order to find the car Myrtle was in. They were no longer connected. Everything was being rearranged so new trains could be assembled to head to Nashville and other cities from the junction point here at Chattanooga. She found Myrtle standing on a platform on the other side of the tracks and a knot of colored people who were waiting to get onto the Jim Crow car to Nashville. Violet hurriedly told Myrtle about what had happened the night before, but there was no time to discuss what might have happened because of Mr. Martin, because Violet was supposed to get back to the suffragist car before it was moved. Anyway, I'll see you in Nashville, she said, and hurried away to eat her own breakfast. As she was crossing the track, she saw a woman carrying a basket stumble and fall. Violet hurried over to help the woman up. She was tall and angular and bony, and Violet saw with embarrassment in an interesting condition. Violet could feel her face burn. Ladies who were about to have babies, at least as soon as the woman seemed about to have a baby, usually stayed home. Violet picked up the lady's basket and also a scrap of black cloth that had fallen on the tracks. "Let me carry this for you," she suggested. "Thank you, child." The woman put her hand on the small of her back and winced painfully. "I'm just going over to the platform to set down." Goodness, that hurt. Doesn't seem to have done any harm to the little one, though. He's still kicking away. Embarrassed by this forthright talk, Violet carried the basket and the cloth across the tracks and up onto the platform. It was a picnic basket, but it looked to her like there were folded clothes in it. The woman sat down painfully on the bench, still holding her back. "Thank you, child. Just put that down right here. That's my son's uniform. They're sending him home from France. He's supposed to be shipped to Chattanooga today." Violet thought that was a funny way of putting it, and then she looked at the piece of black cloth in her hand, and a thought struck her. "Is your son, did he—" "Yes," said the woman. "Put that on my arm, would you, dear? It's supposed to be my mourning." The war had ended almost 2 years ago, but American soldiers' bodies were still being shipped home from France. It was a slow process, apparently. Violet shook out the black cloth and folded it diagonally, then again to make an armband. She wrapped it around the woman's gray calico sleeve. She could see in the seam that the calico had once been dark blue, but it had faded and worn whisper thin from many washings. She tied the armband neatly. "Thank you. Ow." The woman winced and put her hand on her belly, and Violet looked at her, worried. The woman's face was drawn and gray, with a strand of gray hair hung damply down from under her straw hat. Violet had never understood the phrase hatchet-faced before, but now she did. The woman looked as though her face had been cut out of a block of wood with a hatchet. It was all sharp, hard angles. "Are you going to be all right?" Violet asked. "I don't know," said the woman. "You know, child, if men knew how much work it is having babies, I'm not sure they'd be quite so willing to start wars and have our babies blow each other up." "My brother was in France, too," Violet said. "But he came back," she added apologetically, "with shell shock. He never talks anymore." The gray lady nodded. "I hope the good Lord will grant that this is my last one," she said, resting both hands on her swollen belly, "and that no one dreams up a war to take this one away from me." Violet was just about to repeat what Miss Dexter had said, that the human race had outgrown war, when a barefoot newsboy thrust a newspaper at them and hollered, "Extras! Russians surround Warsaw, Poland under siege, Warsaw to fall by weekend." Miss Dexter was wrong, Violet thought, about a lot of things. "If you could vote," Violet said, "then you'd be able to vote against wars." "Vote?" The woman looked as surprised as if Violet had just suggested she tap dance. "My husband would never allow that." Violet was about to answer when a loud clang made her look up, and she saw that the Suffs tourist car was being hitched onto the train. "Excuse me," she cried. "That's my train. Goodbye." She waved and hurried to clamber back aboard before they left without her. As the train pulled out, Violet looked back. She could see the hatchet-faced woman sitting beside her basket, an angular gray figure growing smaller in the distance until the train rounded a curve and she disappeared. Violet wondered what it would be like to be waiting for your son to come home from France in a box. She thought about the woman giving birth to her son. Violet's mother had told her that babies were brought by a stork, but Flossie had given Violet a different explanation that sounded slightly less unlikely. And then changing his diapers and teaching him table manners and sending him off to school and making beef tea for him when he was sick, and then being told by the government that she had to send him off to France so that he could come home in a box. The more Violet thought about it, the angrier she got. Suddenly, Violet understood why all these women were riding to Nashville on a train. It was so that women would never have to sit by in silence while men made decisions they didn't like, whether it was father deciding that Chloe couldn't go to college, or the government deciding that people's sons had to go fight in France whether they wanted to or not. The train pulled into a small station, a flag stop. A little covered platform was a jumble of trunks, porters, and valises. Men and women in stiff-looking best clothes milled about waiting for the train doors to open. Another newsboy who looked about 8 years old was hawking papers, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Riots! Riots in Ireland!" Then, when that didn't attract any customers, "Tigers beat Yankees!" Miss Dexter stood up and waved out the open window. "Paper," she called. The boy came over and handed a paper through the window. Violet could smell the fresh ink. Miss Dexter dropped 3 pennies into his outstretched hand. The train doors had opened, and a few people went down the steps onto the wooden platform. Violet stared. If she hadn't known better, she would have sworn one of the people who got off the train was Mr. Martin. She looked again. It was Mr. Martin. But how was that possible? Mr. Martin had jumped off a completely different train the night before. She hardly had time to wonder before she noticed someone following Mr. Martin, or what it looked like, or that's what it looked like anyway. It wasn't one of the agents from last night, but the man wore a starched collar. Of course, most men did, and he walked with a speed and sense of purpose that seemed out of place on a railroad platform. Violet sprang to her feet. She started up the aisle toward the exit. Maybe there was time before the train left to warn Mr. Martin that he was being followed. She was in the vestibule when the train started moving. She pushed at the exit door, but it wouldn't open. She gave it a hard push, and it came open just as a hand grabbed Violet from behind. "Let me go!" She hit out at whoever was holding her. On the platform, she saw a small colored girl running toward Mr. Martin. She couldn't see if it was Myrtle. The train was already picking up speed, and the station was soon out of sight. The conductor let go of her. "I don't know what you're playing at, missy," he said disagreeably, "but you're a Nashville passenger, and to Nashville you're going." Violet hadn't wanted to get off, only to make sure Mr. Martin knew he was being followed. But it was no business of the conductor's. "I can get off the train if I want to," she said angrily. "Why would you want to?" the conductor said. "You're paid through to Nashville." He opened the door to the suffragist car. "Now back to your seat, miss." Thanks for listening.